A body is found in April. Well, parts of a body are found, and no one is caught. Then as time goes by, more body parts are found within a mile of the last incident. Who's doing this? And more importantly, why?
What you are about to hear is believed to be real, based on witness accounts, testimonies, and public record. This is terrifying and true.
Tonight's story is not pleasant. It's about the murder of 3 young women and how it's been impossible to solve for multiple decades. In a place where most people would assume life is simple and safe, Oklahoma. But those who actually know something about Oklahoma know that Oklahoma City is like any other urban sprawl. It has its positives along with its negatives, and one of those negatives is crime. So we'll be taking a deep dive into the pertinent details of this case, and as we dig into the gory details, see if any answers make sense. All this after these quick words from our sponsors. Crimes against people of different religions, sexualities, nationalities, and color is nothing new to America or the world at large. Many nations have had their land stained red from its native inhabitants. This is also to say nothing of the various inquisitions, witch hunts, and other historical atrocities. It can be said that the history of man is one of continuing violence towards those that any individual or society deems different. And when it comes to unsolved crimes, it's much the same story. Our subject today concerns such a case. It is one that, while small in scale, has a potential to link one of America's most notorious killers. It's a crime that has drawn comparison to those of London's Jack the Ripper and other similar murder cases. This is the story of the Oklahoma City Butcher. The killings began on Thursday, April 1st, 1976, when 3 oil workers entered an abandoned property. Upon making their way through the home, one of the men tripped over what was initially believed to be debris. Upon closer inspection, the supposed debris turned out to be a human thigh. While fleeing the property, a human head was found in an empty popcorn bucket. When the men called the police to report the incident, their statement was dismissed as an April Fool's prank. Detectives on the scene took note that the remains were of a female. One of the victim's hands along with her sex organs were missing. Investigators theorized the former was removed in an attempt to conceal the identity, while the latter was taken as a kind of trophy. Also, the face of the victim was horrifically mutilated. Most noticeably was a smile being carved from the corners of her mouth to her ears. Autopsy work concluded that the victim was of Native American descent and between 18 and 22 years old, and possibly homeless. Facial reconstruction was performed, and photographs of the mock-up were distributed throughout the area, but no one at the time was able to identify her. Just over 3 years later, in 1979, again on a Thursday in April, this time on the 19th, a dog set loose to a nearby field returned to its owner with a human head hanging from its mouth. This incident occurred half a mile from where the first victim was found. When police arrived on the scene, they set their own dogs out to the area, with identical results. The animals located more human remains wrapped in newspapers and inside of paper bags. The victim turned out to be another female whose remains were cleaned before they were disposed of. 6 days later, the victim, through fingerprint analysis, was identified as 22-year-old Arlie Bell Killian, another Native American. She was seen only hours before her remains were discovered. Her killer, however, was not through. Up until May 1st, more of Killian's remains would be found scattered throughout the neighborhood. During this time, 2 men, including Killian's brother, a violent psychiatric patient who escaped custody one day before Killian was discovered, were arrested and held. But with the newer body parts being distributed by the killer, both suspects were cleared and set free. With the area now on full alert, the killer decided to forbear on satiating their sadistic urges. In early March of 1986, just around the block from where the first of Arlie Killian's remains were discovered, and incredibly again on a Thursday, a third female victim was found. 6 days later, March 12, 1986, a garbage bin was intentionally set aflame. When the fire was quelled, the head of the latest victim was found. Analysis of her tattoos led to an identification: 22-year-old Tina Marcia Sanders. She was last seen on March 5th, one day before her remains were discovered. Shortly after, to no one's surprise, it was announced that all 3 murders were connected and a serial killer was responsible. A profile of the killer was put together detailing the following proposed attributes: a resident of the nearby area, specifically targeting Native American women with a history of drugs and being homeless, may have contracted a venereal disease as a result of sleeping with one of these women, may have had a harsh upbringing where a female or group of females ran the household. Between victims number 2 and 3, the killer may have been in prison or on active military duty. Initially, the killer was profiled as having some sort of medical expertise due to the removal of bodily organs. However, this was dismissed as it was evident that savage mutilation was carried out in place of precise incisions, much to the contrast of another unsolved murder, that of Elizabeth Short, aka the Black Dahlia. In a surprisingly unsurprising turn of events, in 1983, Henry Lee Lucas, a nomadic serial killer, confessed to Arlie Killian's murder shortly after he was arrested. Upon scrutiny, however, Lucas's confession was eventually debunked, as he was proven to be a compulsive liar, and in the years since his arrest and death, many of his crimes have been debated in their authenticity. His time in Oklahoma City was equivalent to only passing through on the highway, which was typical of Lucas to not stick around after committing one of his crimes. The true murderer clearly knew the area very well and returned to the crime scenes again and again. In 1993, victim number 1, through DNA analysis, was identified as 18-year-old Kathy Lynn Shackelford, a runaway. Officially, this is the last lead before the case went cold. According to crime writer Michael Newton, the killer, or a copycat, was still active. Remains of a victim were found in 1985 during construction of the Centennial Expressway. Later, remains were also discovered of a Hispanic or Native American woman unearthed from a shallow grave on April 22, 1995. In this instance, 50 miles west of Oklahoma City. In 2007, 52-year-old Roderick Webster was arrested and eventually convicted for the 1989 mutilation and murder of 75-year-old Audrey Harris, who was disemboweled similarly to the 3 victims of the Oklahoma butcher. Being that Webster never left the Oklahoma City area, he was strongly considered a suspect for the unsolved murders. However, in this instance, the victim was not a homeless woman. Harris was attacked in her home. and was a Caucasian. Webster to this day has not been charged with any of the Oklahoma City murders, and the case remains officially unsolved. The United States is a country with a very sordid past involving the treatment of Native Americans. Many will point to such atrocities as simply part of building the nation. To this day, Native Americans still face many challenges, whether it be in relation to land rights, environmental hazards, hate, violence, or drug addiction. But not since arguably the days of the discovery of the country or even the days of the Wild West did the U.S. see such savagery like the Oklahoma City killings. The city was gripped by terror for over a decade, and it took nearly 2 decades for a victim to even be identified. This is also not to say of the possibility that, like Michael Newton suggested, the killer or an imitator kept on with the murder spree. For all we know, perhaps there are more butcher victims that were never linked to the case, or ever had their remains found. With all those things considered, the Oklahoma City Butcher remains one of the most notorious unknown serial killers in American history. Whether he or she is alive and inactive, or long since dead, not a single citizen in Oklahoma City, and even the country, hope he or she ever makes a return. One of the hardest parts of running Terrifying and True here at Weekly Spooky is hearing how devastating some of these stories are that have never been solved. Ever since I was a little child watching unsolved mysteries when I was homesick from school or pretending to be sick and home from school, I just remember having this sense of awe and wonder and fear, but also this sense of sadness and dread. I guess as we get older, we get more and more empathetic. And that's not a bad thing. I'm very proud of my empathy, but boy, do reading stories like this hurt. They make you feel awful. I do hope that there's somehow some information that could come to light to help the girls' families seek closure. But at the same time, I hope this is the last we ever hear of the Oklahoma City Butcher. I hope they're either in prison or the grave. Either one I'll accept at this point. I do find comfort in the idea that this monster will never have the fame of some other serial killers we all know as household names. But what do you think? Can this killer be caught? Frankly, I just don't know. Terrifying and True is narrated by Enrique Couto. This episode is written by Morgan Moore. It's executive produced by Rob Fields, produced by Daniel Wilder, with original theme music by Ray Mattis. If you have a story you'd like us to cover on the program, send us an email at weeklyspooky@gmail.com. And if you want to support us in a very direct way, go to weeklyspooky.com and click on Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you can support us and allow us to keep the spooky rolling and rolling and rolling. And I want to say a big thank you to our Patreon podcast boosters, folks who pay just a little bit more to hear their names at the end of the show. And they are John Kalin, Johnny Nix, Bobbletopia.com, Megan Hua, Julia Kirsch, Brent McCullough, Steve King, Karen Weemet, Jack Kerr, and Craig Cohen. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time right here on Weekly Spooky and Terrifying and True.